Today we will be discussing the HMHS Britannic, sister ship to the Titanic, which sank 109 years ago on this very day. The Britannic was built to become one of the largest and most glamorous ocean liners to ever sail the North Atlantic. However, due to the First World War, she would end up being sunk at the hands of a German sea mine. The Britannic emerged out of the long-standing and legendary rivalry between the White Star Line and the Cunard Line, which both vied for dominance over the transatlantic shipping trade between Britain and America. And in order to try and take control of this market and win the great game that they had going between them, so to speak, every now and then they'd come out with a new ocean liner or set of ocean liners which would trump anything that had come before. In 1899, that was White Star's Oceanic, and in 1906, that was Cunard's Greyhounds, the Lusitania and the Mauretania, which were, at the time of their construction, the largest and fastest ships ever constructed. In fact, the Mauretania would end up holding on to her transatlantic speed record for about a quarter of a century. Now, the White Star Line knew that they'd have to actually provide a proper counter to this, and so, under the leadership of J. Bruce Ismay, they came up with one in the form of the Olympic class, consisting of the RMS Olympic, RMS Titanic, and the HMHS Britannic. The contract for the construction was handed to the legendary Harland and Wolff shipyards in Belfast, Ireland, and these ships were to become the largest ships in the world, although not the fastest, as White Star had by this point manoeuvred itself towards a policy of not really gunning for speed, but rather gunning for luxury. So, sure, Cunard, they can have the blue riband, they can have the transatlantic speed record, but White Star would have the largest and most luxurious ships afloat. And in many respects, they were. The Olympic entered service in 1911, and had a very successful, and barring a collision with the HMS Hawke, had a very successful and fruitful career. The Titanic, on the other hand, well, as we all know, on the 14th of April 1912, she struck an iceberg and sank, leading to the deaths of over 1,500 people. And, well, at this time the Britannic was still under construction, which meant that she was in a perfect position to incorporate some of the lessons that had been learned from Titanic and Olympic. Now, of course, following the Titanic disaster, one of the big criticisms that was laid at the White Star Line was that Titanic hadn't had enough lifeboats for everyone on board. Now, this wasn't entirely fair, as, well, sure it didn't. Titanic still actually exceeded the regulations for the time, and as the Board of Trade, which regulated these things in Britain at the time, required a ship of Titanic size to only have 16 lifeboats. Titanic had 20, but in any case, the Britannic and the Olympic would still need more, and whilst the Olympic would just have lifeboats just sort of chucked on wherever they could fit them, with Britannic, they came up with a much more clever solution, as since she was still under construction, they could get a bit more creative with it. So what they did with Britannic is they fitted her with gantry davits, these massive cranes, right? And they'd have a stack of lifeboats next to them, and so these gantry davits, they'd swing in, pick up lifeboat, swing out, and launch it. And not only would these have far greater sort of range of motion over the side of the ship than the Welland davits used by Titanic, as you can see there, but they'd also preserve deck space, as it would mean that the lifeboats would all be bunched up, and the rest of the boat deck could just be free for, well, promenade deck, for great views of the ocean. And on top of that, Britannic was also fitted to be more luxurious than Titanic and Olympic, as, you know, as usual, lessons had been learned from the other two and were now applied to Britannic. So she had a number of things covered over well deck, a gymnasium for second class, a bit more room for third class, just some general improvements that would just make it just that bit more luxurious, and incidentally also larger than the Titanic and Olympic in terms of tonnage, although, funnily enough, the Britannic still would not end up being the largest ship in the world, as by the time of her construction, that title was already taken by the German ocean liner, the SS Imperator. So, by 1914, Britannic was still under construction, but she had been launched and was now being fitted out for a prosperous career as an ocean liner. However, this would end up being interrupted by the outbreak of the First World War. And as the First World War developed into what was at that point one of, if not the deadliest war in history, the great powers began to run into a bit of an issue. See, they had wounded soldiers piling up on their front lines, and they needed to get them out to hospitals, or out to get proper medical care, as, well, sure, a tent in the field can patch up a wound. The soldiers that were near death really needed some more proper, clean, and more ample healthcare. So, in order to transport them, they employed the use of hospital ships. So, these hospital ships would be requisitioned ocean liners, including the Britannic and some other legendary liners such as the Mauretania and the Aquitania. And these liners would be filled up with wounded soldiers and would transport them back home. So, at the end of 1915, Britannic was requisitioned for this purpose, as she was set to work on transporting troops away from Gallipoli, and she did this very well. She was handed back over to White Star, who then began fitting her out as an ocean liner again. Then later on in 1916, she was once again requisitioned as a hospital ship, served a number of successful voyages, and then she would end up sailing out for what would end up becoming her last ever voyage, sailing out of Southampton, England, bound for Lemnos in Greece, on the 12th of November 1916. Now, after some days sailing and a brief delay in Naples due to a storm, the Britannic was on her way again and was now finally on her final day of the voyage. It was early in the morning. Many of the staff were having breakfast. They'd spent the last couple of days preparing the Britannic to take on thousands of wounded Allied soldiers. And then, out of the blue, at 8:12 in the morning, they struck a mine. And this was, of course, what would end up dooming the Britannic. And, well, funnily enough, the impact with the mine happened to occur at just about the worst possible time. You see, the Britannic, at that particular moment, had been undergoing a shift change. So, one shift of crew down the engine rooms was swapping out for another shift. All routine. The watertight doors were opened up to ease that process. And then the mine struck, and the force of the mine exploding actually jammed a number of the watertight doors, which meant that many more bulkheads and many more watertight compartments could now be flooded. Britannic had received a number of safety upgrades. It's going off of the experiences learned from Titanic, including how Britannic's watertight bulkheads had been extended from E deck, as they had been on Titanic, now up to B deck. So she should have been fine. But there was also another thing, a lot of the nurses and doctors had opened up a whole bunch of portholes in order to air out some of the wards on board, get some fresh air in preparation for the soldiers coming aboard. These portholes were still open when they hit the mine, and therefore began letting water in right down the length of the ship, pretty much, and, well, that basically doomed the Britannic. And she'd end up settling and lower in the water, and whilst the crew would attempt to beach her, as Captain Charles Bartlett would put the engines onto full ahead and would try and beach her on the nearby island of Kia. However, during this time, a couple of lifeboats were prematurely launched without the captain's knowledge or orders, and you see, at this particular moment, the Britannic's stern was beginning to rise out of the water, which included the propellers, which were now beginning to emerge. And see, these couple of lifeboats that were launched, kind of got sucked into the propellers, and since the propellers were still spinning, it meant that it was, well, it was a bit of a blender situation, if I'm honest. So after hearing about this, Captain Bartlett promptly had the engine stopped, abandoned ship fully, and, well, thanks to the gantry davits, as you can see right there, the evacuation actually went remarkably smoothly, with the only deaths having actually come from those couple of lifeboats that got sucked into the propellers. And actually, on that note, on one of those lifeboats was a nurse by the name of Violet Jessup, who had been on board the Olympic when it collided with the HMS Hawke, and had survived the sinking of the Titanic, and would now go on to survive the sinking of the Britannic, and would then continue to serve as a stewardess on ocean liners right up into the 1950s. In any case, though, the Britannic would still end up sinking, finally dropping below the surface at 9:07 on the 21st of November, 1916. And, well, that's where she remains to this day. She lies about 200 feet below the surface of the water, near the Greek island of Kea, and she's actually become a rather popular site for diving, and has become something of an artificial reef for the area. And in spite of going down 109 years ago, striking a mine, laying on her side, and on the bottom of the ocean for over 100 years now, she's still in remarkably good condition. And it's incredible, and it's very likely that she'll continue to be down there, remarkably well preserved for many more decades. So, that was the Britannic. What happened to the Olympic? Well, the Olympic also served in the war. She served as a troop ship. She actually rammed and sank a U-boat, the only ocean liner to ever do so, and would then continue to serve as a very successful and popular ocean liner for a couple more decades, becoming a particular favourite of a number of the celebrities and movie stars in the 1920s, before finally being scrapped in 1936, because of the Great Depression, the White Star Line was forced to merge with its old rival Cunard, and by the 1950s, Cunard bought out the White Star Line name entirely, and White Star ceased to exist in any official capacity, although the Cunard Line does actually still operate to this day, and still to this day operates the only remaining ocean liner. So, that was the Britannic, a ship destined for greatness, only to be destroyed and become yet another casualty of the First World War. So, thank you very much for watching. If you've liked the video, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. If you have any further questions about the topic, or any topics that you'd like me to cover, please leave them in the comments down below, and I will try to answer as many of those comments as I can. And I will see all of you in the next video. Goodbye.